The neighborhood had been designed to sell certainty before it ever sold comfort, a place where every line was straight, every rule was printed, and every promise came wrapped in the same quiet language of safety and order. The houses stood like carefully spaced sentinels, roofs angled just enough to appear unique while still conforming to the same approved palette, lawns trimmed to identical heights as if the grass itself understood compliance. People moved there because nothing unexpected was supposed to happen, because predictability felt like peace, and because the HOA marketed itself not as a governing body but as a guardian of calm. I had bought my home believing that illusion, believing that if I followed the rules, paid the fees, and kept my head down, the neighborhood would function like a background hum rather than a constant presence. For a long time it did. The HOA emails blended into spam folders, the meetings passed unnoticed, and the board members existed only as names at the bottom of monthly reminders. That balance shifted quietly, not with a confrontation or a warning, but with the installation of 4 small security cameras mounted neatly under my eaves, angled toward my driveway, my front door, and the side yard that backed onto a shared walkway. I installed them for reasons that felt reasonable, even boring: a recent increase in package thefts, a car break-in 2 streets over, a general sense that privacy meant less than it used to. The cameras were unobtrusive, matte black, barely visible unless you knew where to look, and they complied with every local ordinance I could find. They did not record audio. They did not point into anyone else's windows. They existed solely to watch my own property. At least, that was how I saw them. Within a week, the atmosphere changed. Neighbors who used to wave began to glance up at the eaves a little longer than necessary. Conversations cut shorter. The shared walkway grew quieter, as if people believed they were stepping onto a stage rather than a sidewalk. It wasn't hostility at first, just awareness, the kind that makes people self-conscious even when they have nothing to hide. The HOA noticed too, though not immediately. Their attention arrived in the form of a letter, slid into my mailbox like any other notice, printed on official letterhead that carried more weight than it should have. The letter cited vague clauses about community standards, privacy concerns, and architectural harmony, language so flexible it could mean almost anything if read with the right tone. It requested, politely but firmly, that I remove the cameras pending review by the board. It did not accuse me of wrongdoing, but it framed the cameras as a potential issue, a deviation from the invisible norm everyone else seemed to accept. I read it twice, then a third time, noticing how carefully it avoided specifics. There was no mention of which rule I had broken, only that my cameras might be in violation of something somewhere in the bylaws. I checked those bylaws myself, scrolling through pages of dense text that governed fence heights, mailbox styles, holiday decorations, and the exact shade of brown allowed for front doors. Nowhere did it prohibit security cameras. In fact, a small section even acknowledged them, provided they were not intrusive. Mine weren't. I responded in writing, attaching photos, diagrams, and excerpts from the HOA's own rules, my tone calm, factual, almost apologetic for daring to defend myself. The reply came faster than I expected, not with clarification, but with escalation. The board insisted that complaints had been raised, that residents felt uncomfortable, that the cameras created a hostile environment. The language shifted subtly, framing my personal security choice as a community threat. That was when I realized this wasn't about rules at all. It was about control. The HOA didn't like anything that shifted power away from their oversight, and cameras, even silent ones, represented eyes they did not command. The board president, a woman whose reputation preceded her more than her actual presence, became the unspoken face of the issue. She had lived in the neighborhood since the first phase of construction, had served on the board for years, and was known for enforcing rules with a zeal that bordered on personal mission. People whispered about her inspections, her handwritten notes left on doors, her habit of appearing at the exact moment someone's trash can was visible from the street. She didn't like unpredictability, and cameras introduced an element she couldn't fully manage. The next notice from the HOA dropped any pretense of suggestion. It demanded removal by a specified date, threatened fines, and hinted at further action if I failed to comply. It cited community harmony as justification, a phrase so broad it could swallow any objection whole. I felt the familiar pressure that HOAs rely on, the assumption that most people will cave rather than risk prolonged conflict. For a moment, I considered it. Taking down the cameras would have been easier. It would have restored the quiet, the invisible agreement that everyone follows the rules even when the rules are unclear. But something about the demand bothered me more than the cameras ever could. It wasn't just that they wanted them gone. It was that they wanted obedience without explanation, compliance without accountability. I declined. My response was brief this time, citing the same bylaws, reiterating that the cameras were legal, non-intrusive, and necessary for my security. I added that I would be happy to discuss the matter at the next board meeting. That offer, I later realized, was taken not as cooperation but as challenge. The reaction was immediate and oddly intense. Notices appeared on community boards about privacy. Emails circulated reminding residents of their right to feel safe from surveillance, carefully avoiding my name while making the target obvious. The narrative shifted again, casting me not as a homeowner protecting his property, but as a threat to neighborhood trust. I watched it unfold through my own cameras, seeing board members stop on the walkway, glance up, gesture to each other, their expressions tight with irritation. It was then that an idea formed, not out of spite but out of clarity. If the HOA believed cameras were a problem, it was because they didn't control the narrative they created. They held meetings behind closed doors, documented decisions in sanitized minutes, and presented outcomes without context. Transparency was optional when you owned the process. But what if that process was visible? What if the same logic they used against me was applied to them? The next board meeting was scheduled for the following week, a routine gathering meant to address budgets, landscaping contracts, and undoubtedly my cameras. Meetings were technically open to residents, but attendance was always sparse, discouraged by timing, tone, and the subtle hostility toward anyone who asked questions. I decided to attend, not just in person, but online. Using equipment I already owned, positioned well within my legal rights, I prepared to live stream the meeting, not to provoke, but to document. There was no rule against recording public HOA meetings. The bylaws even encouraged transparency, at least on paper. I announced my intention beforehand, posting a simple notice on the community forum that the meeting would be streamed for residents unable to attend. The response was immediate and polarized. Some thanked me, relieved at the idea of access. Others warned me to reconsider, hinting at consequences without naming them. The board itself remained silent, a silence that felt less like consent and more like calculation. The night of the meeting approached with a strange sense of inevitability, as if something long buried under routine was about to surface. I checked the cameras one last time, their quiet presence suddenly symbolic of more than security. They were no longer just watching my property. They were about to watch power react to being seen. As the day ended and the neighborhood settled into its usual stillness, porch lights flicked on in unison, and the HOA clubhouse stood ready, unaware that its carefully controlled environment was about to meet an audience it had never accounted for, setting the stage for what would unfold next. The morning of the meeting arrived with a tension that felt heavier than any notice the HOA had ever sent, the kind of quiet pressure that settles in long before anything actually happens. The neighborhood looked the same as it always did, pristine and orderly, but the routines underneath it felt strained, as if everyone was aware that something was about to disrupt the pattern. Cars left driveways earlier than usual, garage doors closed faster, and people avoided lingering on sidewalks. I spent the early hours preparing, not out of excitement, but with the methodical focus of someone documenting a process rather than staging a confrontation. The livestream setup was simple by design, a camera mounted at chest height, a secondary angle capturing the board table, and a clean audio feed to ensure nothing could later be dismissed as misheard or taken out of context. I tested everything twice, then a third time, not because I expected failure, but because I knew that any technical issue would be used to undermine whatever followed. Transparency only works when it's clean. As the meeting time approached, notifications began appearing on the community forum, residents confirming they would tune in, others asking whether recording was allowed, some openly skeptical, others quietly curious. The HOA finally responded with a brief statement reminding everyone of meeting decorum and warning against disruptions, a message that felt less like guidance and more like a preemptive defense. They didn't prohibit the stream. They couldn't. Instead, they leaned on implication, the suggestion that something improper might occur simply by making their process visible. When I arrived at the clubhouse, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The room was arranged as it always was, long table at the front, chairs lined up in rigid rows, documents stacked neatly as if order itself could be summoned through alignment. The board members sat together, their posture unified, expressions neutral but tight, eyes flicking briefly toward the camera before returning to their papers. The board president sat at the center, hands folded, shoulders squared, projecting calm authority with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being unchallenged. The camera went live exactly on time. Within minutes, the viewer count climbed higher than I had expected, names appearing from across the neighborhood, people who had never attended a meeting in person now watching from their living rooms. The meeting began with routine formalities, approvals of previous minutes, budget updates delivered in a monotone that assumed no one was really listening. But people were listening now. You could feel it in the room, the subtle shift in energy as board members realized that every word carried further than usual. The board president's demeanor changed first, her tone growing sharper, her movements more deliberate, as if asserting control through presence alone. When the agenda reached the item labeled vaguely as security concerns, the air thickened. The narrative unfolded exactly as expected, framed carefully to position the HOA as protectors and me as a complication. References were made to resident discomfort, to community values, to the importance of trust, all delivered without acknowledging that the cameras complied fully with the rules they claimed to enforce. As the discussion continued, restraint eroded. What began as formal commentary shifted into something more personal, frustration leaking through the polished language. The board president gestured toward the camera repeatedly, her irritation no longer subtle, her body language speaking louder than her words. She framed the live stream itself as part of the problem, suggesting that broadcasting internal matters threatened the cohesion of the neighborhood, a claim that drew visible reactions from viewers as the chat filled with disbelief. The irony was unmistakable. A board demanding the removal of cameras over privacy concerns was now objecting to being seen while conducting official business. The longer the meeting went on, the more the mask slipped. Interruptions grew frequent, voices overlapped, and the board president's attempts to maintain authority became increasingly forceful. She dismissed questions raised by residents attending in person, waved off procedural concerns, and spoke over anyone who challenged her framing of the issue. Each moment was captured cleanly, without commentary, without embellishment, the camera doing nothing more than recording exactly what was happening. The live stream chat scrolled rapidly, residents reacting in real time, some shocked by the hostility they were witnessing, others recognizing patterns they had experienced privately for years. The board president seemed unaware of how she appeared on screen, or perhaps she was too accustomed to unchecked power to adjust. Her frustration escalated into open aggression, her posture rigid, her expressions sharp, her tone condescending whenever dissent surfaced. She questioned motives, implied bad faith, and framed compliance as a moral obligation rather than a contractual one. The meeting no longer resembled a discussion. It had become a performance of control, and the audience was watching closely. As the agenda item concluded, not with resolution but with an assertion that the matter would be handled, the damage was already done. The image of a calm, reasonable HOA protecting its community had fractured. In its place was a visible display of authority reacting poorly to scrutiny. When the meeting adjourned, the board members left quickly, avoiding the camera, their composure strained. The live stream ended quietly without commentary, the recording automatically archived and saved. Within minutes, clips began circulating in private messages, then on the community forum, then beyond it. Residents who had never questioned the HOA before began sharing their own stories, connecting what they had seen to years of unexplained fines, dismissed concerns, and selective enforcement. The board president's behavior became the focal point, not because it was exaggerated, but because it was undeniable. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Conversations resumed on sidewalks, but now they carried a new tone, one of comparison and realization. The cameras on my house remained untouched, quietly observing as the HOA faced something it had never truly encountered before, collective awareness. And as the board scrambled to contain the fallout, it became clear that the meeting had not resolved anything. It had only opened the door to what would come next, a reckoning that could no longer be managed behind closed doors. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like a crack forming beneath fresh paint, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore once it reached the surface. The morning after the live stream, the HOA's usual silence was replaced by frantic activity. Emails began circulating early, not the standard reminders about trash bins or lawn edges, but carefully worded statements attempting to reframe what residents had witnessed. The board described the meeting as misrepresented, the tone as taken out of context, and the live stream itself as unauthorized in spirit if not in rule. It was an effort to regain control through language, to soften what had been raw and undeniable. But the problem with recorded reality was that it didn't bend. The footage existed exactly as it was, complete, uninterrupted, and archived across multiple devices. Anyone could watch it again, pause it, rewind it, and see for themselves what the board now insisted had been misunderstood. The neighborhood forum, once a quiet place for lost pets and garage sale notices, became active in a way it never had before. Posts multiplied, not aggressive at first, but inquisitive. Residents asked simple questions about process, authority, and rules, questions that had always existed but had never been voiced publicly. Others shared their own experiences, small incidents they had brushed off at the time now re-examined through the lens of what they had seen. Fines that appeared arbitrary, warnings that felt personal, decisions made without explanation. Individually, they had seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. The board attempted to respond, but their replies felt rehearsed, repeating phrases about community harmony and established procedures without addressing specifics. That only fueled further scrutiny. The cameras on my house became almost symbolic, no longer the center of fear, but a reminder of how visibility shifted power. Neighbors who once avoided looking up at them now glanced deliberately, some even nodding, as if acknowledging that those lenses had done something they hadn't known how to do themselves. The board president remained conspicuously absent from public discussion. Her name appeared frequently, but never her voice. Other board members attempted to step forward, issuing statements on her behalf, insisting that emotions had run high and that lessons would be learned. The language suggested damage control rather than reflection. Meanwhile, the HOA's enforcement arm seemed to hesitate. Notices slowed. Inspections were postponed. It was as if the system itself was uncertain, aware that every action might now be questioned, documented, and shared. That uncertainty created space. Residents began organizing, not in protest, but in conversation. Small groups formed, comparing bylaws, reviewing past communications, realizing how little they actually knew about the structure governing their daily lives. The HOA had relied on apathy for years, on the assumption that no one would invest the time to look closely. The livestream had broken that assumption. I watched all of this unfold quietly, resisting the urge to comment or explain. The footage spoke for itself, and any attempt to guide interpretation would only weaken its impact. The cameras continued recording their usual mundane scenes, delivery trucks, joggers, kids on bikes, but their presence now carried a different weight. They represented not surveillance, but memory. The HOA couldn't rewrite what had been seen, no matter how carefully they phrased their emails. A second notice arrived from the board, this one more cautious, requesting a private discussion about the cameras. The demand was gone, replaced by an invitation, a clear shift in tone. It acknowledged compliance with bylaws while still expressing concern, and attempted to escalate without admitting fault. I declined the private meeting, suggesting instead that any discussion occur during a scheduled board session, open to residents, with recording permitted. The response was delayed, then non-committal. It was clear that privacy was suddenly desirable when transparency no longer favored them. As days passed, the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Clips found their way onto social media platforms, stripped of identifying details but unmistakable in their dynamics. Viewers from outside recognized the pattern instantly, commenting on how familiar it felt, how HOAs everywhere seemed to operate under the same playbook. What had begun as a local dispute became a broader example, a case study in how small authorities react when exposed to scrutiny. The board could no longer pretend this was an isolated issue. Their actions were now being observed by an audience that didn't live under their jurisdiction and therefore felt no pressure to remain polite. Inside the neighborhood, reactions grew bolder. Residents who had never attended meetings before began requesting agendas in advance, asking for explanations of enforcement criteria, questioning why certain rules were emphasized while others were ignored. The board struggled to keep up, their usual strategies ineffective against sustained attention. The board president finally reappeared, issuing a statement that attempted to strike a conciliatory tone, acknowledging concerns while defending her intentions. But even that statement carried traces of the same defensiveness seen in the meeting, the same inability to separate authority from identity. It didn't calm the situation. If anything, it confirmed what residents had already concluded. Authority, once questioned, couldn't simply be reasserted through reassurance. It had to be earned. The cameras remained untouched, still mounted exactly where they had been installed, still compliant, still quiet. They no longer felt like a point of conflict. They felt like a line that had already been crossed. And as the HOA prepared for its next scheduled meeting, under pressure, under observation, and under a level of accountability it had never faced before, it became clear that the livestream had not been an ending. It had been an opening, and whatever happened next would unfold in full view, whether the board liked it or not. The days leading up to the next board meeting felt less like a countdown and more like a slow compression, pressure building quietly in spaces that had never held tension before. The neighborhood, once defined by its predictability, now carried an undercurrent of anticipation. People lingered longer at mailboxes, exchanged looks that suggested shared understanding, and spoke in lowered voices about things that had never been discussed openly. The HOA clubhouse, usually an overlooked structure at the edge of the common green, became a focal point, a physical symbol of authority that now felt strangely fragile. The board announced the upcoming meeting with an unusual level of formality, emphasizing order, respect, and adherence to procedure, as if repetition alone could restore the old hierarchy. This time, they explicitly acknowledged that the meeting would be recorded, framing it as a concession to transparency rather than a necessity imposed by circumstance. The agenda was longer than usual, padded with administrative items that felt like buffers placed deliberately before the issues everyone actually cared about. I prepared the live stream again, refining angles, ensuring redundancy, anticipating every possible technical criticism before it could be raised. The setup was no longer just about documenting one dispute. It had become infrastructure for accountability. As the meeting time approached, the viewer count climbed even faster than before, residents sharing the link with neighbors who had missed the first stream, people tuning in early as if afraid to miss something important. The board members arrived together, their cohesion more rigid than before, a visual reminder of unity meant to project strength. The board president entered last, her expression controlled, almost rehearsed, the visible frustration of the previous meeting replaced by a careful stillness. It was the stillness of someone aware that every movement was being watched, analyzed, and remembered. The meeting opened with procedural formalities, but the atmosphere was unmistakably different. There was less casual authority, more deliberate phrasing, pauses where there had once been assumptions. Each board member seemed acutely aware of the camera, adjusting posture, choosing words carefully, as if speaking not just to the room but to an unseen jury. When the agenda finally reached the topic of security cameras and community privacy, the presentation was markedly different from before. The language was softer, the framing more balanced, acknowledging homeowner rights while still expressing concern for shared spaces. It was an attempt at recalibration, a recognition that overt aggression no longer played well when preserved on video. But restraint could only go so far. As residents raised questions, calmly and methodically, the underlying tension resurfaced. Requests for clarification exposed inconsistencies in enforcement. Comparisons were drawn between allowed structures and prohibited ones, between past decisions and current demands. Each question was simple on its own, but together they formed a web that the board struggled to navigate without contradiction. The board president maintained composure longer this time, but subtle signs of irritation crept in, tightened jaw, clipped responses, a tendency to redirect rather than answer directly. The livestream chat reflected the shift, viewers noting the contrast between this controlled demeanor and the hostility of the previous meeting, recognizing the change not as growth but as strategy. The board attempted to close the discussion with assurances of review and promises to form a committee, a familiar tactic meant to defer resolution. But the audience, both in the room and online, was no longer satisfied with vague outcomes. The demand wasn't for punishment or spectacle. It was for clarity. When the board president asserted that the HOA retained final authority regardless of resident opinion, the statement landed differently than it might have weeks earlier. It wasn't met with silence or acceptance, but with visible reaction, residents shifting in their seats, chat messages spiking as viewers recognized the reassertion of control beneath the polished language. The meeting adjourned without a definitive decision, but the balance had clearly shifted. Authority had been challenged not through rebellion, but through observation. In the days that followed, the HOA's internal fractures became more visible. Board members contradicted each other in emails. Committees were announced, then redefined. Deadlines were set, then quietly extended. The board president's name appeared less frequently on communications, replaced by collective language that diluted individual accountability. Residents continued to share clips, not sensationalizing them, but using them as reference points in discussions about governance, fairness, and the purpose of the HOA itself. Cameras on my house remained unchanged, their quiet presence now almost mundane again, yet charged with significance. They no longer felt like instruments of conflict, but like witnesses that had already fulfilled their roles simply by existing. What had started as an attempt to enforce conformity had exposed a deeper truth about power, one that extended beyond a single neighborhood. The HOA's authority had always depended on obscurity, on the assumption that no one would look too closely. Once that assumption failed, every action required justification, every decision invited scrutiny. As the board prepared its next steps behind closed doors, it became clear that the issue was no longer about cameras at all. It was about whether an institution built on quiet compliance could adapt to an environment where its actions were no longer invisible. The answer, still unfolding, would determine not just the outcome of one dispute, but the future relationship between the HOA and the community it claimed to serve, setting the stage for consequences that were only beginning to take shape. The weeks that followed the second live stream marked a subtle but irreversible shift in how the neighborhood understood itself. A transformation that didn't announce its arrival with conflict, but revealed itself through changing habits and expectations. The HOA's presence, once a distant authority felt only through emails and enforcement notices, was now a subject of daily conversation. Residents compared interpretations of bylaws the way they once compared lawn treatments, discovering how much ambiguity had been allowed to harden into unquestioned power over time. The board, meanwhile, moved with visible caution, their communications measured, their enforcement inconsistent, as if uncertainty had crept into a system designed to operate without hesitation. The board president remained technically in her position, but her influence felt diminished, her role constrained by an awareness that any misstep could be captured, shared, and dissected. It was during this period of adjustment that the HOA announced a formal review of its governance policies, a move framed as proactive but widely understood as reactive. Committees were formed, surveys distributed, and residents invited to submit feedback, gestures that might once have seemed generous but now felt overdue. Participation surged. People who had never responded to an HOA inquiry before filled out forms, wrote emails, and attended sessions, driven not by anger but by a sense that their involvement might finally matter. The cameras on my house became almost incidental, rarely mentioned directly, yet always present in the background of these discussions, a reminder of what had catalyzed the change. I continued to live stream meetings, not to provoke but to maintain consistency, establishing transparency as a norm rather than an exception. The board adapted, some members more successfully than others, learning to speak with deliberation, to justify decisions rather than declare them. The board president struggled the most. Her authority had always been rooted in certainty, and the new environment demanded flexibility she didn't seem comfortable with. Subtle tensions surfaced during meetings, moments where her impatience threatened to resurface, only to be reined in at the last moment. Viewers noticed. Comments reflected sympathy mixed with criticism, recognizing the difficulty of adjusting while holding leaders accountable for past behavior. Outside the meetings, the neighborhood's social fabric continued to evolve. Informal gatherings formed, residents meeting in small groups to discuss potential reforms, sharing ideas about term limits, clearer enforcement standards, and improved communication. These conversations weren't radical. They were practical, grounded in a desire for predictability without oppression. The HOA's original promise, peace of mind, was being redefined by the people it governed rather than the board alone. The board's response to this grassroots engagement was uneven. Some members embraced it, seeing an opportunity to rebuild trust. Others viewed it as a threat, a dilution of authority they had worked years to consolidate. That divide became increasingly apparent, with resignations quietly rumored and alliances shifting behind the scenes. The board president's public demeanor remained controlled, but private frustration leaked through in occasional terse messages, hints of resentment toward what she perceived as a loss of respect. Meanwhile, external attention continued. The clips circulated online had sparked broader conversations about HOAs, drawing commentary from legal experts, community organizers, and residents from other neighborhoods who recognized similar dynamics. My situation became an example cited in discussions about surveillance, governance, and transparency, often without my direct involvement. I observed these discussions from a distance, careful not to insert myself as a spokesperson. The focus, I believed, should remain on the process, not the personality. The HOA eventually issued a formal statement acknowledging mistakes in communication and committing to revised guidelines regarding security devices and meeting transparency. It stopped short of an apology, but it was the closest thing to accountability the board had ever offered. Reactions were mixed. Some residents welcomed it as progress. Others saw it as insufficient, a surface-level concession that avoided deeper issues. Still, it represented movement, something that had been unimaginable before the cameras. Enforcement actions resumed cautiously, each one now scrutinized for consistency. The board president's role became increasingly ceremonial, her once dominant presence diluted by shared decision-making and procedural safeguards demanded by residents. The neighborhood felt different, not necessarily calmer, but more awake. People understood their rules better, questioned authority more confidently, and recognized the power of documentation. The cameras continued to record quietly, their footage mostly unremarkable, yet their influence undeniable. They had transformed a static system into a dynamic one, forced an institution to confront its own reflection, and given residents a sense of agency they hadn't known they were missing. As the HOA prepared for its annual elections, with new candidates stepping forward and long-standing assumptions up for debate, it became clear that the story was far from over. The question was no longer whether the cameras would stay, but whether the HOA itself could evolve under sustained visibility, or whether the pressure of being seen would expose fractures too deep to mend, setting the stage for the final chapters of a conflict that had grown far beyond its original cause. By the time the HOA announced the date for the annual election meeting, the neighborhood had entered a phase that felt unfamiliar even to longtime residents, a state of alert awareness where nothing was taken at face value anymore. The announcement itself was carefully worded, emphasizing continuity, stability, and the importance of experienced leadership, phrases that once would have passed unnoticed, but now sounded like signals of anxiety rather than confidence. Yard signs began appearing for the first time in the community's history, not flashy or confrontational, but modest notices supporting new candidates who promised transparency, clearer rules, and limits on discretionary enforcement. The very existence of these signs marked a quiet revolution. For years, board positions had been filled through inertia, the same names rotating through roles because no one else wanted the scrutiny or the hassle. Now people were stepping forward not out of ambition, but out of recognition that disengagement had consequences. The board president's response to this shift was subtle but unmistakable. She began attending meetings earlier, arriving before the room filled, positioning herself as the anchor of continuity in an environment she felt slipping away. Her demeanor was composed, almost restrained, but the tension beneath it was visible to anyone paying attention. Each meeting felt like a negotiation between old authority and emerging accountability. The livestream continued, now an expected feature rather than an intrusion, and its presence shaped behavior in ways no rule ever had. Board members spoke slower, corrected themselves mid-sentence, and deferred decisions rather than issuing commands. The audience, both in the room and online, noticed these changes and discussed them openly, analyzing tone and consistency the way sports fans analyze plays. The HOA attempted to regain initiative by proposing revisions to the bylaws, presenting them as modernization efforts. Drafts were circulated with highlights emphasizing clarity and fairness, but residents quickly identified sections that preserved broad discretionary power under softer language. Discussions grew more sophisticated, informed by shared research and outside perspectives. Legal terminology that once intimidated people became familiar, its meaning unpacked collectively. The board president, accustomed to directing conversations, found herself responding rather than leading, her authority increasingly dependent on persuasion rather than position. Outside the meetings, the social dynamics of the neighborhood continued to evolve. People who had barely known each other beyond polite greetings now exchanged messages, shared documents, and coordinated attendance. The HOA's power structure, once centralized and opaque, was being counterbalanced by a distributed network of informed residents. The cameras on my house remained unchanged, still quietly recording everyday scenes, but their symbolic weight persisted. They represented a line that had been crossed and could not be uncrossed. Visibility had become part of the neighborhood's infrastructure. The board president made one final attempt to assert control through procedure, introducing strict speaking limits and revised decorum rules that disproportionately affected residents raising questions. The move was immediately recognized for what it was, an effort to reimpose hierarchy under the guise of order. The livestream captured the reactions, the collective pause as people realized how familiar the tactic was. Pushback followed, measured but firm, residents citing the HOA's own governing documents to challenge the changes. The board retreated again, modifying the proposal, its confidence visibly shaken. As election day approached, the atmosphere grew charged but not chaotic. There were no confrontations, no dramatic showdowns, just an accumulation of small, deliberate acts of participation. Ballots were requested in record numbers. Questions were submitted in advance. Candidates released written statements outlining their positions, something unheard of before. The board president released her own statement, emphasizing her years of service and commitment to community standards, but it landed differently than it once would have. Service without accountability no longer carried the same weight. On the day of the election meeting, the clubhouse filled beyond capacity, with overflow attendees watching online. The process unfolded methodically, each step observed, recorded, and verified. When the results were announced, the shift became undeniable. New candidates secured seats not as a hostile takeover, but as a recalibration of governance. The board president retained a position, but no longer the central one, her influence diluted by a board no longer aligned around her authority. The reaction was restrained, professional, but the significance was profound. Power had not been seized, it had been redistributed. In the days that followed, the HOA began the slow process of adjustment. Committees were restructured. Enforcement guidelines were clarified. Past decisions were reviewed with an eye toward consistency rather than precedent alone. The cameras remained where they were, their presence now almost invisible again, yet woven into the fabric of how the community operated. The neighborhood felt steadier, not because conflict had disappeared, but because it was now visible and therefore manageable. What had begun as a demand to remove security cameras had culminated in a transformation of governance, achieved not through defiance, but through sustained observation. As the HOA moved forward under its new configuration, it was clear that the story was no longer about one homeowner or one board president. It was about a community that had learned, perhaps for the first time, that being seen could change everything. The period after the election did not bring instant calm, but it did bring a new kind of tension, one rooted not in fear but in adjustment. The HOA, now partially reshaped by new leadership, faced the difficult task that follows any shift in power, translating intention into practice. The routines that had once operated on habit alone now required explanation, documentation, and consensus. Old procedures were revisited, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with unexpected enthusiasm, as board members realized that clarity protected them as much as it protected residents. Meetings took on a different rhythm. Where there had once been declarations, there were now discussions. Where there had once been assumptions, there were now references to text, policy, and precedent. The live stream, still running as consistently as ever, captured these changes without commentary, allowing viewers to witness not just decisions but deliberation itself. That visibility altered behavior in subtle ways. Board members prepared more thoroughly, anticipating questions rather than reacting to them. Residents framed concerns with evidence rather than emotion, knowing that thoughtful engagement carried more weight than outrage when preserved on record. The former board president, still seated among them, adapted unevenly. At times, she participated constructively, drawing on her institutional memory to explain why certain rules existed. At other moments, frustration surfaced, particularly when long-standing practices were challenged or overturned. Those moments were instructive rather than explosive, reminders that authority does not disappear overnight but must be renegotiated continuously. Outside the clubhouse, the neighborhood's social dynamics continued to evolve. The informal networks that had formed during the height of the conflict did not dissolve with the election. Instead, they matured into channels for information sharing and mutual support. Residents exchanged summaries of meetings, clarified procedural changes, and helped newcomers understand the HOA's role without the intimidation that had once accompanied it. Trust, while not fully restored, began to reassemble in pieces, supported by the simple fact that fewer decisions were being made in darkness. The cameras on my house, still positioned exactly as before, had become part of the scenery again. Children rode past without glancing up. Neighbors paused in my driveway to chat. The earlier unease had given way to familiarity, the recognition that the cameras were not tools of judgment but of record. Their influence was felt less through what they captured daily and more through what they had already made possible. The HOA, now under sustained observation, found itself responding not just to internal expectations, but to an external standard of reasonableness shaped by the community itself. That standard was tested when a contentious enforcement issue arose unrelated to my property. involving a homeowner cited for a violation that had historically been ignored. In the past, such a case would have been resolved quietly, perhaps with an appeal dismissed behind closed doors. This time it unfolded publicly. The board reviewed the matter in session, examined precedent, and acknowledged inconsistency. The decision to rescind the citation was not dramatic, but it was transformative. It demonstrated that the system could correct itself when errors were visible. The live-stream chat reflected cautious optimism, residents noting that fairness did not require perfection, only accountability. The former board president's reaction to this moment was telling. She did not object openly, but her silence carried weight, signaling a gradual acceptance that the standards had changed. As months passed, the HOA's communications grew clearer and less frequent, focused more on information than instruction. Enforcement actions declined, not because rules were abandoned, but because compliance improved when expectations were explicit and applied evenly. The neighborhood felt quieter in a different way, less constrained by unspoken threats and more guided by shared understanding. The cameras continued recording, their footage unremarkable, yet their presence remained a safeguard, a reminder that governance now existed within a frame of visibility that could not be easily removed. The board experimented with additional transparency measures, publishing draft agendas early, releasing detailed minutes, and inviting resident feedback before final votes. These practices were not universally embraced at first, but they endured because they worked. Participation stabilized, no longer driven by crisis but by habit. The former board president gradually shifted roles, stepping back from enforcement discussions and focusing on advisory tasks where her experience was useful without being dominant. The transition was not announced. It simply happened, the result of a system no longer centered on a single personality. Through it all, I remained largely in the background, attending meetings, maintaining the stream, and resisting invitations to define the narrative. The story no longer belonged to any one person. It belonged to the process itself, to the way a community recalibrated when it decided that being seen was not a threat but a responsibility. As the year progressed, the HOA's identity evolved from an enforcer of conformity into a manager of shared interests, imperfect but accountable. The cameras stayed where they were, not as symbols of conflict, but as quiet fixtures in a neighborhood that had learned the value of memory. And as the initial controversy faded into routine, it became clear that the most lasting change was not in the bylaws or the board seats, but in the collective awareness that power, once visible, must be exercised with care, because the record always remains. As the months passed and the intensity of change settled into something more sustainable, the neighborhood entered a phase that felt both calmer and more complex. The immediate drama had faded, but its consequences continued to shape decisions in ways that were not always obvious. Transparency, once an exception forced by circumstance, had become an expectation woven into daily governance. Residents no longer asked whether meetings would be recorded, they assumed it. Agendas were read closely before sessions began, and board members approached discussions with an awareness that every choice would live beyond the room. This did not eliminate disagreement, it reframed it. Conflicts now unfolded within a structure that demanded justification rather than assertion, and that requirement altered behavior at every level. The HOA's operations became slower but more deliberate, a trade-off many were willing to accept in exchange for fairness. The board, now accustomed to scrutiny, developed a rhythm that balanced caution with confidence. New members, unburdened by years of unchecked authority, brought a different energy to discussions, one that valued explanation over enforcement. The former board president continued to attend meetings, but her presence had shifted again, this time into something closer to historical reference than command. She spoke less, listened more, and when she did intervene, it was often to clarify past decisions rather than defend them. The change was not framed as defeat, but it was unmistakable. Power had redistributed itself quietly, not through confrontation, but through the sustained presence of an audience. Outside the formal structures, the neighborhood's social fabric continued to strengthen. Trust, once fractured, rebuilt itself in small, practical ways. Residents volunteered for committees, organized community events, and communicated directly rather than through complaint channels. The HOA, recognizing this shift, began supporting initiatives that had once been dismissed as unnecessary: neighborhood cleanups, shared maintenance days, informal gatherings that fostered connection rather than compliance. These efforts did not erase past tensions, but they created new associations that diluted them. The cameras on my house remained unchanged, their lenses now so familiar that visitors rarely noticed them. They had ceased to be symbols of surveillance and become markers of a turning point, quiet witnesses to a transformation that no longer needed constant reinforcement. The board occasionally revisited the topic of security devices, refining guidelines to reflect what had been learned. The updated language acknowledged the legitimacy of personal security measures while establishing clear boundaries to protect privacy, a balance that had seemed impossible when the issue was framed as a threat rather than a conversation. The live stream continued, but its role evolved. Viewership stabilized at a consistent level, no longer spiking with outrage, but maintaining a steady presence that signaled ongoing interest. The chat grew quieter, more procedural, reflecting a community that had moved from reaction to participation. Residents referenced past meetings as precedent, creating an informal archive of governance that strengthened institutional memory. The HOA, once reactive, became more proactive, addressing potential issues before they escalated, aware that surprises played poorly under observation. The broader online attention diminished as well, the story no longer fitting neatly into the narrative of unchecked authority. That absence of spectacle was itself a sign of success. The HOA had adapted, not perfectly, but sufficiently to remove itself from the category of cautionary tale. Within the neighborhood, the most significant changes were often the least visible. New residents moved in with a clearer understanding of the HOA's role, informed by accessible records and open processes. Longtime homeowners reported feeling less anxious about compliance, more confident that questions would be answered rather than dismissed. The former board president eventually announced her intention to step down at the end of her term, framing it as a natural transition rather than a response to events. The announcement was received without drama, a sign of how far the community had come. There were acknowledgments of her service, tempered by recognition of the lessons learned during her tenure. The cameras continued to record, but their footage remained unremarkable, a testament to stability rather than tension. The neighborhood had not become utopian, disagreements still arose, rules were still enforced, but the underlying dynamic had changed. Authority was no longer assumed to be correct by default. It was expected to explain itself, to document its reasoning, and to accept correction when necessary. That expectation, once established, proved remarkably durable. As the year drew toward its end, the HOA conducted a self-assessment, publishing a report that outlined changes made, challenges encountered, and goals for the future. The document, while modest in tone, represented a level of self-awareness that would have been unthinkable before the cameras. Residents reviewed it critically but constructively, offering feedback that was incorporated rather than ignored. The process felt collaborative rather than adversarial. The cameras, still quietly mounted, had fulfilled their role not by constant intervention, but by making intervention possible. They had shifted the balance from control to accountability, from obscurity to record. As the community settled into this new equilibrium, it became clear that the most enduring legacy of the conflict was not the preservation of security devices, but the normalization of visibility itself. What had once felt intrusive had become foundational, a reminder that systems function best when they are designed to be seen. And with that understanding firmly in place, the neighborhood moved forward, not forgetting what had happened, but integrating it into a collective memory that would guide decisions long after the cameras themselves had faded into the background. The approach of the next year brought with it a quieter kind of reckoning, one that did not announce itself through conflict but revealed itself through reflection. The neighborhood, having endured its period of disruption and adjustment, now lived inside the consequences of what it had learned. Transparency was no longer novel, and accountability was no longer reactive. They had become embedded expectations, shaping behavior even when no one was actively watching. The HOA, once defined by its ability to enforce, now measured its success by its ability to explain. That shift changed not only how decisions were made, but how they were perceived. Residents no longer viewed the board as an opposing force, but as a mechanism that required maintenance, oversight, and participation to function properly. The meetings reflected this evolution. Attendance stabilized at a level that suggested sustained interest rather than crisis-driven curiosity. Discussions were structured, sometimes lengthy, occasionally tedious, but grounded in process rather than personality. The live stream continued uninterrupted, no longer controversial, simply present, its steady existence reinforcing the idea that nothing about governance needed to be hidden to work effectively. Board members referenced previous recordings when clarifying decisions, treating the archive as a shared memory rather than a liability. The former board president, now nearing the end of her term, adopted a noticeably reflective posture. She spoke openly about the early years of the HOA, about intentions that had hardened into habits, and about how authority, when unchallenged, could drift away from service. These moments did not erase the past, but they reframed it, allowing the community to understand how easily systems could slide into imbalance without malice, simply through repetition and silence. Outside the meetings, the neighborhood experienced subtle but meaningful changes. Disputes between residents were resolved more often through conversation than escalation, aided by clearer rules and a shared understanding of process. The HOA served as mediator rather than enforcer in many cases, a role that reduced tension and increased trust. New residents were welcomed with orientation materials that explained not just the rules, but the reasoning behind them, setting expectations that participation was normal rather than exceptional. The cameras on my house remained where they had always been, their presence now so normalized that they rarely entered conversation. They were no longer associated with conflict or resistance. Instead, they existed as quiet proof that documentation did not destroy community, but could, under the right conditions, strengthen it. Their footage continued to be uneventful, capturing nothing more dramatic than changing seasons and everyday life, a reminder that the most powerful impact they had ever made came not from what they recorded, but from what they enabled others to see. The HOA undertook a comprehensive review of its enforcement history, not as an admission of wrongdoing, but as an effort to establish consistency moving forward. Patterns emerged that validated many of the concerns raised during the height of the controversy. Adjustments were made, some quietly, others formally acknowledged. Residents responded with cautious approval, recognizing progress without expecting perfection. The culture of the neighborhood shifted further toward shared responsibility, with committees rotating membership regularly to avoid consolidation of influence. The board president's final months were marked by a gradual withdrawal from the spotlight. She attended meetings, contributed when asked, and prepared for transition without spectacle. When her successor was announced, the moment passed without tension, a testament to how thoroughly the community had moved beyond reliance on any single figure. The transition was smooth, procedural, and uneventful, exactly the kind of outcome that once would have been unthinkable. As the year closed, the HOA hosted a community forum not to address a crisis, but to solicit ideas for the future. Attendance was strong, discussion respectful, and the atmosphere collaborative. The live stream captured the event as it had captured so many others, its quiet presence reinforcing continuity. Residents spoke about landscaping, amenities, long-term planning, topics that had been overshadowed by conflict before. The shift felt complete. The system had recalibrated itself around visibility and participation, not because it was forced to, but because it had learned that doing so worked. The cameras remained unchanged, their role fulfilled yet ongoing, a constant option rather than an active intervention. As the neighborhood settled into this new equilibrium, it became clear that the most enduring change was internal. People understood their power differently now, not as something to wield, but as something to maintain collectively. The HOA, once a symbol of restriction, had become a structure that reflected the community's values more accurately, imperfect but responsive. And as the year turned, the story approached its final chapter not with drama, but with the quiet assurance that what had been learned would not easily be forgotten, because it had been recorded, remembered, and integrated into the way the community now lived. The end of the story did not arrive with a single defining moment, because by the time the final chapter began, the conflict itself had already dissolved into something more durable than resolution. What remained was structure, memory, and a changed understanding of how authority functioned when it was no longer shielded by obscurity. The neighborhood had moved past the shock of exposure and into a quieter, more mature phase, one where transparency was no longer reactive but assumed. Meetings occurred on schedule, recorded without debate, and attended by residents who no longer felt like intruders in a process that governed their lives. The HOA, once rigid and defensive, now operated with an awareness that every decision formed part of a public record, not as a threat, but as a responsibility. That awareness shaped behavior even in moments when disagreement arose, encouraging deliberation rather than dominance. The cameras on my house remained exactly where they had been installed at the beginning of the dispute, unchanged in position, purpose, or legality. Their presence no longer sparked discomfort or discussion. They had become part of the background of daily life, quietly capturing the ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood without incident. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. The devices that had once been framed as dangerous had proven to be harmless, while the unchecked authority that had challenged them had been revealed as the true source of instability. The HOA's revised policies took full effect, codifying transparency, clarifying enforcement standards, and establishing clear avenues for appeal that were documented and accessible. These changes did not eliminate conflict, but they contained it, preventing disagreements from metastasizing into resentment. Residents adjusted to the new normal gradually, learning that participation was not burdensome when it was meaningful. Attendance at meetings stabilized, not because people were afraid of missing something, but because they valued staying informed. The live stream continued to run without interruption, a quiet testament to consistency rather than controversy. New board members grew into their roles under the watchful but supportive eye of the community, aware that legitimacy now came from clarity rather than control. The former board president completed her term and stepped away without fanfare. There were acknowledgments of her service, but no attempt to rewrite history. Her departure marked the end of an era defined by certainty and the beginning of one shaped by accountability. The transition was smooth, almost anticlimactic, and that was its greatest success. Authority had been decentered, redistributed across a system designed to withstand individual influence. The neighborhood itself reflected this shift in subtle ways. Residents spoke openly about rules and expectations, resolved issues through conversation, and treated the HOA not as an adversary, but as a tool that required care and attention. The cameras continued recording, their footage uneventful, a visual reminder that stability does not produce spectacle. The true impact of the live stream that started it all was not in the moments of conflict it preserved, but in the habits it helped create. Visibility had changed the incentives of power. As the story drew to a close, the significance of what had happened became clearer in retrospect. The demand to remove security cameras had been a symptom, not the cause, of a deeper imbalance. By resisting that demand within the bounds of the rules, and by exposing the process rather than attacking individuals, the conflict had been transformed into an opportunity for systemic change. The neighborhood had learned that oversight did not require hostility, and that accountability could coexist with order. The HOA, once reliant on silence, had adapted to scrutiny and emerged more resilient for it. The cameras remained, not as trophies or warnings, but as quiet fixtures in a community that had learned the value of being seen. The final image was not one of confrontation, but of continuity, porch lights turning on at dusk, sidewalks filling with evening walkers, meetings proceeding without incident. The story ended not with victory or defeat, but with equilibrium, a balance achieved through the simple act of recording what had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged.